folks, so this video is going to be the first of a series of videos that I'm going to call Prepping Cheap. The intent of these videos, and I don't know exactly how many are going to be in the series, but the intent of these videos is to give people ideas on how to prep in the least expensive way possible. That being said, a lot of the suggestions and tips that I'm going to be covering in these videos aren't necessarily the best. They're not the most ideal. Excuse me. They're not the most ideal. They're not even the most effective. However, they are the cheapest, and if you're scraping by, struggling to put food on the table, struggling to pay bills, this might help you out a little bit. Again, these are not the ideal ways of doing things, but they will work to a point, to a degree. So, when I'm talking about, in this video, I'm going to be talking about food storage options. And when I'm talking about food storage, I'm going to completely ignore the aspect of the bulk freeze-dried foods that you can get from the store, the cans of freeze-dried foods like Augustin Farms, Mountain House, and Ready Hour, and all these other brands. We're not even going to discuss that because if you're scraping by, those things are way out of your budget. What we're going to be focusing on are things that you can do yourself at home. Again, for as little money as possible. Now, when you're talking about prepping food, food storage at home, there are generally two ways that preppers do this. It's either through vacuum sealing or canning. Now, freezing is an option, but freezing, I'm not really going to consider that food storage in this sense, simply because you're bagging it up, you're putting it in your freezer, you're taking it out, and if you lose power and you can't provide power to that freezer, keep that freezer running, eventually that stuff will thaw out and it will spoil. The reason I'm not considering that food storage is because without power, you don't have anything. The options that I'm going to cover here, vacuum sealing and canning, that food that's put up that way will last even if you don't have power. That's why I'm considering that the primary forms of food storage. Now, getting back to the two types, vacuum sealing and canning. And there's some differences in between those two. Let's start with the vacuum sealing. Typically, when preppers talk about vacuum sealing food, and again, we're talking about things like pasta, rice, dried beans, sugar, flour, cornmeal, things like that. The first thing that a lot of preppers think of is Mylar bags and oxygen absorbers. Now, Mylar bags like this come in different sizes, anywhere from really small ones all the way up to 5-gallon bags. This is a 1-gallon bag. Some are able to be sealed with a vacuum sealer, like Food Saver. Most are not, though. So typically, you'll have to take one of these bags, put your food in it, drop in the appropriate sized oxygen absorber, squeeze out as much air as you can, and then use an iron to seal the top. These are cheap, but not extremely cheap. You can get, I think the price has actually gone up here lately. I think about 50 of these 1-gallon bags will be somewhere around $20 to $25. So you're looking at about 50 cents per bag right there. The next option for vacuum sealing is, again, with the Food Saver, the vacuum sealer. And you might also find a Seal-A-Mill, which is also owned by Food Saver. The rival Seal-A-Mill is also owned by Food Saver. There's a couple of other brands that they're kind of like off brands, but they're all essentially the same. They can work on bags made out of this. Now this is a roll of bag material. It's simply a roll where it's sealed on two sides. This end is open, and if you unroll this, the other end will be open. What you would do is you would roll it out to what you need, cut off the appropriate size with scissors. And food savers generally have two functions. They have a vacuum and seal, and then just a seal function. You would use the seal function to seal up one end, and then the remaining one open end, pour your food in, leaving about 1.5 inches to 2 inches of space, sometimes more. It all depends on what you're trying to seal up. Put the end in the vacuum sealer and press the vacuum and seal button. It will pull out all the air, and then while it's maintaining a vacuum, it will heat seal the other end. And you can do meats, you can do dehydrated vegetables, you can put frozen vegetables in here and vacuum seal them so that they don't get freezer burned. You can do dried beans, you can do rice, although you can do pasta. Although with things like rice and pasta, you have to be careful that the sharp edges of the food product don't puncture this plastic. Because if it does, then you're going to lose your vacuum and you're back to where you started. With a product that will be exposed to air, and air, light, and moisture are the three things that will degrade your food. And those are the three things you're trying to protect your food from. Now, generally, when you seal food products in either these vacuum seal bags or the Mylar bags, you then want to put them in something like a 5-gallon bucket or a Rubbermaid tote. I can't speak today. And that would protect them from light and moisture, and the bags would seal the individual products. There's one other thing that you can vacuum seal with a food saver, though, and it's something that not a lot of people are aware of. And I plan on doing a video on this in the near future. That might be in one of my next videos in this series. But the next thing that you can do is you can get, most of their food savers have an accessory port built on it. Not all of them, but most of them do. And it's where you can take an accessory, hook it to that port using a rubber tube or a hose. And they make these attachments that look like a little plastic cap. They can actually sit on these mason jars. And what you would do is, okay, that lid's sealed to that jar without any kind of vacuum. And that will happen. But anyway, what you would do is you would fill your product in here. Again, sugar, flour, cornmeal, pasta, dried beans, rice, what have you, as long as it's a dry material. Then you can put your lid on there, put the cap on there, press the vacuum button. It will actually draw a vacuum on this and seal that lid. Then all you got to do is take that cap off, and if you want, you can put your ring on it. You can actually even vacuum seal it. If you leave this ring loose, you can even vacuum seal it with that ring on there and then just tighten the ring down. You can do it either way. There's another way of putting food up in these jars, these mason jars, besides vacuum sealing and pressure canning or water bath canning, and I'll go over that in a little bit. Alright, so hang on folks, I'll be right back. Alright, so sorry about that folks. Alright, the next thing that people typically think of when they're talking about putting up food in at home, they're thinking about these, the mason jars themselves. Now, these aren't like the Mylar bags. These aren't cheap. They're not necessarily extremely expensive, but they're not necessarily cheap either. A dozen quart jars might cost you $10 to $12, depending on where you get them. and what kind of sale you can find and what the demand is at that time of the year. But you can get a dozen or so probably for about $12. So you're looking at maybe $1 a piece. If you're lucky, you can find some of these at flea markets or yard sales fairly cheap. And then all you have to worry about is buying the lids and the rings. A box of rings might cost you about $3. A box of lids might cost you a couple of dollars. And I think there might be like a dozen in each box, if I remember right. This is the next best thing. From the Mylar and the vacuum seal bags, this is the best home preservation method for food, whether it's dry or it's actually canned processed food. The problem is, again, if you're scraping by, you might not be able to afford this, just like you might not be able to afford a food saver, which costs $80 to $100. The bags cost $10, $12 a roll. The Mylar bags, $25 for 100, or 50, $25 for 50. So you might not be able to afford that either. But with these, you can water bath can, but there's a very few things that you can do that with. Typically, the best way to can food is through pressure canning. That is really the safest way to do it, and it reduces the risk of any kind of bacteria or contamination in the food itself causing any problems in the future. These jars can be used another way. It's called dry canning. And I didn't do as much prep for this as I thought I would. It's kind of doing it on the fly. But dry canning is essentially, you take the lid and the ring off, you put your food in here, and this you would want to restrict to things like rice, beans, and pasta. I wouldn't do flour. Me personally, I would not do flour this way, and I probably wouldn't do cornmeal this way. But particularly flour, because the dust from flour can be flammable. A lot of people aren't aware of that, but it can be flammable. So dry canning, I would restrict to dried beans, dried rice, and dried pasta. Use your own judgment for the rest of it. But what you would do is you would fill it up, say right about there, leave the ring and the lid off, put it in your oven, and you would, I don't remember, like I said, I'm doing this off the top of my head, but you would basically bake it in the oven for a certain amount of time at an extremely low temperature. You don't want, because you don't want to burn the food, you don't want to completely bake the food, you just want to heat it up really good and dry it out. So it would be, for example, 150 to 170 degrees. Sorry about that, folks. I got a couple of 40-year-old men riding around on mini bikes. I don't remember exactly how long you would do it or the exact temperature, but I believe it's somewhere around 150 to 170 degrees. You just want to get it nice and hot and dry. Then you would take it out of the oven. You can look this information up online, by the way, but then you would take it out of the oven. Careful, because the jar would be extremely hot at that point. Then you would put your ring on, or put your lid on, put your ring on, snug it down just a little bit, and as this jar cools, it draws a vacuum. Now, this is not the same as canning, like you would a stew or a roast or even green beans or pinto beans or whatever. Any wet cooked food, you would not want to do this way. Let me make that absolutely clear. This is for dry food only. You would do it this way without the lid and without the ring on it. Otherwise, you run the risk of the jar exploding. And I know I'm going to get comments on that most likely because I've seen it other people post about this, and they would get the same comments. Oh, you can't do that because the jar will explode. Well, if you heat it up without the lid and ring on it, no, it won't. You don't put the lid and the ring on until you take it out of the oven and let it cool. The cooling process draws the vacuum and it seals the jar. Plus, it eliminates the possibility of any kind of pest that might be in the food from hatching and causing damage. Okay, again, vacuum sealers, Mylar bags, and mason jars, great ways to store food. But if you're trying to get by very cheap, this may not be the what you can afford. You might not be able to afford to be able to do that. Look for deals wherever you can. If you can find, you might be able to find these at thrift stores, flea markets, yard sales, whatever. Sometimes you can find a jar for 50 cents. If you can, grab it. You don't have to buy a dozen at a time. Grab one here and there. They add up. The next options are a way of storing dry food. Again, dry food only. This is not for wet food. This is not for cooked food. Dry food only. Now, these are a way of storing flour, sugar, cornmeal, rice, pasta, dried beans, anything like that. You can even dehydrate your own vegetables, and you can store them this way, although they're not going to last as long, simply because it's not going to remove the oxygen from them. And they're not necessarily going to be airtight. So you want to, whenever I talk about these things, make sure that these are things that you might already have, but if you do have them, make sure that they're washed thoroughly and dried thoroughly. You do not want any moisture in it. All right, so what are the options? The idea here is to, if you can't afford any of these other things, think about what you do have access to and ways you can reuse it. One of the most popular ways of storing food, if you can't afford mason jars, soft drink bottles, 2-liter soft drink bottles. Now, what they'll do typically is soft drinks are highly acidic, so the plastic has to be a little bit thicker than a milk jug. So it makes it more durable. By the way, do not use milk jugs for food storage. Even if you wash them out thoroughly, you'll never be able to get all of the milk proteins out of the jug. And that protein, if sealed up with food, can cause some nasty things to happen. Some very bad things that you don't want. So do not, under any circumstances, use milk jugs for storing water or dried foods. The only thing I would use to store water or dried food in, soft drinks, fruit punch bottles. Again, make sure they're thoroughly washed out and clean and dried. Things like Hawaiian Punch, Arizona tea. Again, soft drink bottles. But if you buy these, or if you know people that do, ask them to save their bottles for you. Won't cost you anything. And what people will do, again, they'll wash these out. They'll wash them out thoroughly with soap and water. They'll allow them to dry, because you want to make sure these are absolutely dry inside so your food doesn't get contaminated and mold. And then I've seen people pour beans into these, rice, flour, sugar. You could even do pasta, although you'd have trouble getting pasta in and out of one of these. It could be done, but it'll be difficult. And then you just put it up on your shelf. You can either stand it up. Some people lay them down like that. Again, it's not vacuum sealed, but it's a way of putting food up in a container that is very cheap, easily obtained, and it'll keep pests out of your food. Might not keep a mouse or a rat out of your food if it gets into your pantry, but things like ants or whatever, you don't have to worry about those getting into your food. So that would be one thing that you could use. What are some other ideas? Most people don't think about it, but this is a mayonnaise jar. Now again, I saved this for something else, and personally I would it's just me. Mayonnaise jars aren't necessarily something I would want to use, simply because, you know, you've got a lot of different ingredients in that, and I don't know. These would probably be just fine for storing the same ingredients or same products you would put in this. Beans, rice, flour, cornmeal, salt, sugar, whatever, pasta. You could probably put that in these no problem, so long as this was thoroughly washed out. Mayonnaise is just one of those things that, although it has a lot of vinegar in it, which should kill any kind of bacteria, and washing it should make it perfectly safe. I don't know, I'm hesitant to put food in this, but you probably could use your own judgment. I actually saved this jar for something completely different. I was actually saving these jars for storing screws. Now, another option, peanut butter jar. If you buy peanut butter, same thing. Exactly the same thing, it's just smaller, unless you get the really big ones. But this is the exact same thing. It won't hold as much as the mayonnaise jar or even the 2-liter bottle. But you can store a good bit of stuff in there, particularly if it's rice or flour or whatever. Something else people don't think about reusing is whenever you go to the store and buy things like mayonnaise or jelly or anything like that. For the most part, they usually come in plastic bottles, but every now and then you'll see them in glass jars, particularly jelly. It's kind of a 50-50 split. You'll find a lot in plastic and a lot in glass. If you can, start buying the ones in glass. Now, my grandmother used to make jellies, jams, or whatever, and she would reuse these. Now, this one has a handle. Not all of them do have a handle on it. But she would reuse these, lid and all. It wouldn't necessarily seal it up suitable for long-term storage, but she would put these in the refrigerator and they would last an easy 6 months, even without a good seal on it. Sometimes, though, these would actually seal. But she would do that. And again, this is just a little glass jelly jar. I haven't even gotten around to taking the label off of this one yet. And it has the little metal lid with the seal on the inside. I have seen her water bath can jellies and get them to seal. Now, I wouldn't trust these beyond 6 months or so. Maybe a year at the most. Again, that's why you need to get familiar with canning and understand the risks involved and learn how to do it safely. But even if you can't seal these up for long-term food storage, if you can get enough of these, again, just like the rest of this stuff, if you're buying a product and it's a container you can reuse, particularly if it's glass, rice, beans, pasta, flour, sugar, cornmeal, what have you. All of it could be stored in here. And if you're buying it anyway, don't just throw these things out. Save them, wash them out. There's a reason that your grandmothers and your great-grandmother who lived through the Great Depression didn't throw things like that away. There's a reason they kept them, because they could reuse them. This next one, this, believe it or not, is a Mount Olive pickle jar. Now, my mom used to love eating pickles, and she would always get these really big jars, so I've got several of these at home. Again, the lid is just like the one on the jelly jar. You probably won't be able to get it to seal. But if you love pickles, you can get the small jars, yeah. You can also get these huge 1-gallon jars. You can put a lot of rice, a lot of beans, pasta, a whole lot of flour. You can probably fit close to 5 pounds worth of flour in this thing. And these you might even be able to dry can with. I don't know, I haven't actually experimented with that, but you might be able to heat these up with the food product inside them and then screw that cap on, and you might even be able to get a vacuum seal on that. I don't know. But all of these items right here would work for storing dried goods. Again, this is not for canned processed foods, not for cooked foods, not for wet foods. You wouldn't want to put any fresh food in it. You could put dehydrated fruits, dehydrated vegetables, again, the rice, beans, pasta, flour, cornmeal, sugar. You can do all of that. Dried herbs that you grow, harvest, and dry. You can put those in these. So these are all options. If these are items that you buy every week, think about the containers that you're buying the product in. You might be able to spend an extra 20 cents on an item, and once that item is done, you'd be able to reuse the glass jar. Or if you can't, think about ways that whatever food you buy in plastic, think about ways that you can reuse this for food storage. These are just some options, some ideas. Again, everybody talks about vacuum seal bags. Mylar is the big prepper topic when it comes to food storage. Mason jars with canning and everything. But if you can't afford those items, if you can't afford the pressure canner, if you can't afford the vacuum sealer, and all of that is an investment, but it's an investment that will pay you back over time. But if you can't afford those 3 items, look at what you buy every day or every week and figure out how you can reuse it. Most people just throw this stuff away. If you're prepping and you're trying to figure out how you can store food, but you can't afford glass jars, you can't afford mason jars, you can't afford a food saver, this might be another option for you. Again, it won't be vacuum sealed. It won't extend the life of your food as much as vacuum sealing would or dehydrating, but it'll help keep pests out. And it'll give you containers that you can use to put things up in. So rethink about not just what you're buying in the store, but think about the container it comes in. You might not be able to afford to buy something specifically for food storage, but you can reuse what you've already paid for. Maximize your money. That's one way to do it. It's just a tip, just some thoughts, things that I've seen other people do and things that I've done myself. Anyway, this video has gone on quite a while, longer than I thought it would. With that, that's all I've got. I appreciate you guys watching. Like, share, subscribe. If you haven't, I hope you found this video useful and helpful. I will be coming out with some more in this series, but I'm going to space them out because I want to do some research on each individual one that I do, because I want to give you the best information I possibly can for saving your money and giving you the best options I possibly can. Anyway, that's all I've got. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it was useful for you. Until next time, folks, take care. I'll catch you later.